Doom is one of those franchises that no matter what is happening in the gaming landscape, it will always hold my interest, and I will always be interested to see what is done with it in any upcoming projects. So when I see a trailer for a new Doom game, which has a lot of medieval inspirations, especially in the art style, I'm even more fascinated to see what happens with this game. This video will be my general thoughts on the game now I have finished it all the way through, and I will try and let you know whether I think it is worth picking it up for yourselves. It is worth noting that I won't be spoiling anything in the story, and most of my footage will come from the first half of the game. And of course I will try and be as general as I can, especially when it comes to story beats. Any footage of cutscenes that will be used in this video will be anything released in the game's trailers themselves, so I will try and keep it as broad as possible. So with that being said, let's get into Doom: The Dark Ages. The quote-unquote modern Doom games kicked off with Doom 2016, and it's rather a curious beast in the landscape of FPS gaming at the time. The genre had moved far away from the days of the original Doom. While games in that franchise had been drip-fed over the years, it's safe to say that Doom 3 was a game that wanted to stay consistent more with the trends of the genre rather than keep to that very original concept, which for better or worse, some people like, some people don't. However, by the time 2016 had rolled by, Doom's contemporary in Wolfenstein had been rebooted with The New Order that very much paid homage to what that franchise had once been in yesteryear. And I think by that point a fresh take on the FPS genre was particularly needed, especially by this point I think people were starting to get a little bit sick or fatigued with games like Call of Duty at this point. They'd very much become mainstream in the genre. So then Doom came out. I ended up playing the game a few years later and found its old school mixed with new school gameplay particularly great, but once I was satisfied with the overall experience, I was happy to move on to other games. The same cannot be said with the follow-up in Doom Eternal. Eternal really gripped me more so than its predecessor, which was already a pretty amazing experience for me. The combat loop felt more engaging to me, the environment's even more interesting, and I certainly found the story fascinating enough to really want to eat up every nugget I could find on wikis, lore tabs and videos, despite somewhat of a bare bones story compared to other games at the time. And I ended up going through and collecting every collectible, conquering every challenge I could in that game, and played the story a fair few times all the way through. Basically, I was pretty hooked by Doom Eternal. Eventually, of course, I would move on and play other games and deal with life as I was going through university at the time, and so my attentions sort of moved on. That was until a little announcement dropped last year for a new Doom game. Now, why do I bring this all up, all this history of the franchise? Well, I wanted to express how I was feeling going into Dark Ages release. It had been a good few years since I had played Doom Eternal, and I was cautiously optimistic to play this new entry. Would it live up to how much the prior game had really captured me? Would the new theme work as well for the franchise, or would I end up being disappointed overall? Well, on 15th of May, I certainly got my answer. Doom: The Dark Ages is a little bit different from its predecessors in more than a handful of ways. Its gameplay loop feels familiar to those last two titles, with the brutal gameplay and the fast movement that sort of defines its specific franchise. However, the added mechanics that mostly involve the shield the Slayer now has is certainly funny to get used to initially, but once I got through that, I was able to dance through most combat encounters in this sort of graceful ballet of bloodshed. So what exactly in this instant does the shield do for the game? Well, this time you're able to block enemy projectiles. Red projectiles can be blocked but will degrade your sort of shield meter. If this bar runs low enough, then you will not be able to raise the shield again for a couple of seconds, which in-game can be quite a downside, especially at higher difficulties and when there's a lot of enemies firing multiple projectiles at you at the same time. On the other hand, green projectiles and attacks can also be blocked. However, if the shield is raised just before the attack, this can be bounced back to the enemies to deal a bit of damage or stun or other such status effects. Additionally, the shield can be used during traversal sections to do dash attacks that can also be used in combat and in some traversal challenges. This can also be thrown at larger enemies to stun them or to activate certain contraptions when moving around the levels. As well as this, the other big combat change is the melee weapons. Of course, there was always melee weapons in the last 2 games. However, this time I think it has purposefully made them a sort of mainstay feature of your arsenal to really do a lot of damage. There are a handful to unlock that do slightly different things, however you ultimately use them in the same way. Save up limited charges to do big spikes of damage and maybe have some additional effects. The melee weapons are essential to dominating combat further than just your original arsenal, and I think they're incredibly satisfying to use, especially when you start learning to upgrade these weapons, and they can add some really interesting little effects to the combat. While these changes are a fair bit different from Eternal, I think this has actually made combat all the more satisfying, at least to myself. I found that as I was going along, getting used to new enemy types, new weapons being added, etc., all of a sudden the combat just seemed to click just right for me. The flow of this is one of the most satisfying experiences I have had quite recently, to be honest with you. Speaking of the weapons, I feel that the prior to Doom games weaponry is more down to your own personal preference or the current ammo count, as realistically all the weapons kind of act to do the same role, maybe with obvious exceptions such as the BFG. This time, however, I felt that there were many times that I was swapping out to specific weapons to deal with certain enemies or groups of enemies in order to do the maximum amount of damage or be as efficient as possible. The weapons here are also really nicely designed from an art standpoint, and I absolutely love how insane they are willing to go for this game, and it really fits the gothic medieval theme that was particularly being chased here. My particular favourite is the Ravager, which is just a meat grinder made into a gun that shoots out skull fragments from skulls that are constantly being fed into the meat grinder. It's truly an insane weapon when you first unlock it, and I think it absolutely fits the style of Doom, and it certainly felt very satisfying to use on both big hordes of enemies and the more elite enemies. The title of the game may have alluded to it, but of course the game leans more into a medieval art style. So you'll most likely be battling around castles, medieval villages and more, and I absolutely adore this art style, and I think it actually works really, really well with the brutal themes of the series. This also contrasts with the insane technology on show and things such as the mech battles. Yes, you can ride around in a mech and punch giant-sized demons to death. These missions, when they happen, are very cool, and by the time you have ridden in an Atlan a couple of times, you get a few different types of Titan demons to fight. I will say that while these sections are stunning for the power of fantasy and just being able to run through an army of foot demons is always awesome, the combat loop in the mech sections does start to get just a little samey as you get towards the final use of this weapon. As well as the massive mechs, you get to ride a personal dragon for the Slayer, and I was massively surprised how much I enjoyed these missions where you ride this creature. These levels will typically open right up so you can sort of free fly around and deal with certain enemy emplacements around the map before allowing you to land and take the battle to the enemy on foot. For example, in one mission I was tasked with dealing with a few hell ships, so you would fly around, destroy the sentry guns on the ships and then land on them to detonate them from the inside before diving back onto your dragon to proceed further. Of course, in those free fly sections, when you do come come to the enemy emplacements, you sort of enter this sort of on rails dodging mechanic, which I didn't think was too bad, to be honest, and I think the free flying sections really make up for those.
Engines online.
As mentioned in the beginning, I don't really want to put spoilers in this video, but I will briefly touch on the story a little. So Doom: The Dark Ages acts as a prequel to the 2016 Doom game and sees the Slayer fighting alongside the Night Sentinels, who are under threat from a new demon lord called Prince Azrak, who has in fact gained a new ally that seems a little bit odd for the forces of hell. I would describe the story basically as serviceable to link each mission into each other, but I do really think this is one of the weaker aspects of the game, as I feel that the story does tend to wander about a little until you reach the last quarter of the game, where suddenly we go into overdrive, and I do think the last quarter of the game is particularly interesting, and I really like the way that it all sort of wrapped up, at least for now. I feel it would be unfair of me not to discuss the music of the game. While there are a couple of tracks that I think go pretty hard, I do really think you can feel the absence of the Mick Gordon soundtrack. The music for Dark Ages is noticeably not as strong as the last two games, and I feel that that's a real shame, considering that the music for these modern Doom games is a real integral part of the franchise identity since 2016. As I said, it is a real shame, and I do think the game does suffer for this. Obviously, there are a lot of issues going on with id and Mick Gordon, and this has been discussed in many videos elsewhere, so I won't go into the whole thing here, but just fair to say, I think it's a shame that the music has been downgraded here. I do also want to mention that I thought it was really interesting that id this time around had all the difficulties that of course were to be expected, but they also made it so that you could make custom difficulties with a variety of sliders when you were going into the story. I think this is actually really interesting, and I don't think I've really seen this kind of thing being done in different games, so I think the variety of customization when it comes to difficulty is only something that can benefit the game, and I certainly think it opens the door to some really interesting challenges to come up with, and I hope we do see this kind of thing in more games going forward. Overall, for my reviews, I feel that rather than a number ranking system, I feel the best way to rank stuff is really whether I recommend it or I don't recommend it. With that being said, I of course completely recommend Doom: The Dark Ages, and I feel that for the cost of admission, the content that is provided is definitely worth what you get out of it. The story and the music may let it down, but I really do feel like that combat gameplay, the art style, the variety in levels, the dragon, the foot combat, the Atlan mech sections really keep things varied in a really nice way as to not feel like it was going into the samey territory, just doing all the missions on foot, doing the same thing over and over again. And I will definitely be coming back to Doom: The Dark Ages when I'm done with this video for a bit more carnage. Thank you so much for watching my review. I hope that you enjoyed just trying some new stuff out while I'm working on my next long video, and I really wanted to talk about this game as I was really looking forward to it in the lead up. Is there anything you would like me to take a look at? It can be a game, film, etc. If so, just stick it in the comments and I will try and have a look to see if I can make that into a video for you. Of course, I appreciate all the support on my videos, and I will of course see you all in the next one. Have a good one. Bye bye.